This is going to be one of those episodes where if you've ever had missionaries at your door, you'll recognize the shape of the conversation because there's a moment they want you to get to, a sacred origin story. And for Latter day Saints, that moment is the first vision. Now, if you only know this story from the musical, you probably have a picture in your head already of big, earnest America, big, confident destiny, a teenager sort of out in the woods. And the idea is basically God chose me, and now the world is going to have to deal with it. What I want to do today is history, which means I'm going to go slow and look at what is actually in the sources, because when you look closely, the first vision is not one clean story told only once. Joseph Smith himself left multiple first-hand accounts, and they overlap, and then they clash in places. At times they grow, and at other times they narrow. They also change emphasis, and the church today, in its official missionary training manual, tells missionaries very plainly that there are 4 accounts. So we should all be able to agree on that. And just to say before anyone says, well, you've only got 4 accounts, no, there's actually more than that. You've got other retellings by other people still early on, and they become part of how the story is standardized and then exported. And I do want to, because I am in England, I want to bring one British example in because it matters for how this story travels. There's a London book published in the early 1850s that tries to explain Mormonism to English readers. It's tied into the Liverpool emigration stream. We'll come back to it probably later because it helps us see how quickly this story becomes print and how quickly that print becomes portable. So we're going to do something simple today. We're going to read the story as a story, then we're going to put the accounts next to each other, then we're going to ask what missionaries are trained to do with it, and in the end, we're going to look at the newest big church retelling in a book called Saints, which is written like a narrative history for ordinary readers. And the question hanging over the whole episode is this, really. Are these accounts, the 4 accounts, like the Gospels? Are they the same event from different angles? Or are they a different kind of difference to that? And maybe a difference that could create historical problems? Because if we're trying to prepare Christians to have real conversations with Mormon missionaries, then we need to know where the pressure points actually are. We don't need the, oh, I heard this, but, the actual real pressure points, the points that are difficult to explain or sort of push to one side. But before we touch on the accounts themselves, I want us to see how the church trains its missionaries to present this, because this is important in the sense of this is what we actually get to see. It's not just what happened, it's also how it is taught. And for that, we reach again back into the Preach My Gospel. The first vision in there is not treated as some sort of fringe, weird detail. It's treated as foundational. In the Restoration lesson, missionaries are literally told to memorize Joseph Smith's description of seeing the Father and the Son, specifically the section in Joseph Smith history, verses 16 and 17. It's not just a casual suggestion. It's part of the training, but they're also told, on top of that, be ready to describe the first vision using Joseph Smith's own words, and then bear sincere testimony of its truth. So they then have to, as it were, explain why it matters to them personally. So the first vision in the missionary use is not merely an interesting claim. It is a tool and a doorway, and it's the proof of prophet moment, if you will. And it functions like this. if God the Father and Jesus Christ really appeared to Joseph Smith, then we are not debating denominations and slight differences anymore. We're debating whether God restored the church. And Preach My Gospel gives you a short version, sort of the 3 to 10 minute outline. It moves from God is our Heavenly Father, Christ is the Son of God, prophets exist. There was a falling away, and then Joseph Smith is called as a prophet, and the Father and the Son appeared to him. So the story does a lot of work. It anchors 3 things. It anchors the apostasy, the restoration, and then it anchors the authority of Joseph Smith. And here's the key line from the manual that I think is the most important for what we're doing today, because it openly says that there are 4 accounts of the vision recorded by Joseph Smith or scribes under his direction. So even at the level of official church training, the church is not hiding that there's more than one version. But what it does as the manual and the training is it centers on one particular version. It's the canonized version, the Joseph Smith history one, the 1838 account that later gets published. And then it uses the other accounts and brings them in as their supporting detail. Like, also in another account, he says, thy sins are forgiven. So the question then becomes, is that a reliable way to treat sources, or is it a way of smoothing over real tension? Now, I think it's probably time. Let's walk through the story that, if you know it, that most people know. The 1838 account has a very clear shape. It has religious excitement, confusion among denominations, a young Joseph Smith who wants to know, is curious and desiring to know which church is right. And then James 1:5 hits him like lightning. He goes to the wood. He tries to pray. And there is a dark opposing power, then a pillar of light, and then 2 personages appear to him. And the key line is, this is my beloved son, hear him. And then there's a command, join none of the denominations. The creeds are all wrong. There's corruption, and so on. Well, okay, so that's the skeleton, and that's sort of the shape that missionaries are trained to memorize and repeat. And to be fair, it is a really powerful piece of narrative. It does 2 things at once. One, it's an intense spiritual experience. And then secondly, it has an institutional pivot. It doesn't say God comforted me. It also says, on top of that, God judged the churches. But here's the sort of historical thing, and maybe a historical quirk or problem or something that needs dealing with. Although the first vision is said to have happened in 1820, the story didn't arrive in print in 1820 or 1821 or 1825. The first surviving written account is so much later. And I'm not saying late equals false, but I am saying this gap changes the rules of the conversation, because this is the 1820s. It's a pamphlet world, a printing world, a world where religious arguments go to paper first. And in that kind of world, a 12-year gap doesn't feel like nothing. It isn't proof of deception, but it is a real historical pressure point, because it raises the questions that historians should always ask. What do you remember first? What do you emphasize first? Who was he talking to, and what was the purpose of the telling of the story? That, to me, feels fascinating, because this is the church's own narrative story, and Saints knows this. The book, the latest publication, it knows this. It openly acknowledges the gap and then frames it in a particular way. It says it was about persecution, why it wasn't written early, or privacy, or later attempts to write, later public retellings with scribes. So even the official story is saying, yes, the telling and the retelling of this story develops. We'll definitely come back to that. But first, let's put the accounts next to each other, because the differences aren't just small details. Some of them are small, but some of them are not. So, what is the simplest way to do this? We've got 4 first vision accounts that Joseph Smith either wrote himself or dictated under his direction. And then we've got a modern official retelling written by the church that blends details into one smooth, continuous story. So we're going to do 2 things at once. We're going to read the canonized version, the one missionaries center on, and then we're going to put the other accounts next to it and ask what changes, what stays the same, and what kind of differences, and particularly how significant, they actually are. And crucially, even the missionary training material does not deny the differences. It quotes the scriptural account, and then it pulls in lines from another telling as supporting details. So this isn't a secret. And all the readings and images that I've got from the Joseph Smith papers online. And the question is, what do we do with it? What do we do with the fact that there are 4 tellings? So let's start with the earliest surviving written account, the 1832 account, which is really a story of forgiveness first. In the 1832 account, Joseph describes himself as being convicted of his sins, and he's searching the scriptures and concluding that mankind has apostatized, and there is no true religious society built on the gospel as recorded in the New Testament. He describes a pillar of fire and says he was filled with the Spirit of God. And then crucially, he says he saw the Lord, and the Lord says, Joseph, thy sins are forgiven. And it includes the line, I am the Lord of glory, I was crucified for the world. And in the earliest surviving account, the vision is narrated around a single Lord figure, not 2 separate personages. And that is not a small detail. So in the 1832, the center of emphasis is forgiveness and personal redemption, and a single divine figure speaking forgiveness over Joseph Smith. And this is not the same focus as the later public or institutional story. The 1838 account becomes an account of the church question first. So in 1838, the story leans hard into denominational conflict, and it's what is to be done. Who of all these parties are right, or are they all wrong together? And James 1:5 is central. The vision includes 2 personages, and the message becomes, join none of them, join no denomination. Their creeds are all an abomination, and professors of them are corrupt, and they teach commandments of men, and they have a form of godliness, but they deny its power. So in 1838, the center of gravity is not personal redemption, but is authority and apostasy and the justification for restoration. The later accounts, of which there are 2, added texture and added claims. Not in other accounts, you get more of the physical struggle details and the additional heavenly beings, and there are other angles to the story. And the saints' retelling explicitly includes details like his tongue swelling so he could not speak, and footsteps behind him, the sense of an unseen power and thick darkness, and then deliverance. Then the Father and the Son, and then that famous phrase, thy sins are forgiven, but then the apostasy of join none of them. And then there's something else. There's an addition, an extra thought, and a promise to reveal the fullness of the gospel in the future. And at this point, there's even a host of angels. And this feels like a huge amount of content being carried in a short narrative. So the question is not really, the question we should be asking really is not, do they differ? Because they obviously do differ. Even the church tells you there are 4 accounts, but perhaps the historical question is, what kind of differences are these? Are they normal differences of memory and retelling? Or are they the kind of differences that suggest the story is evolving to meet institutional needs? That's the question. And you can't dodge it if you want to have an honest conversation. And I say that to Mormon missionaries and to those who consider themselves to be inside of historic Christianity. If we want to have an honest conversation, we need to rub up against the similarities and the differences in these 4 accounts of the first vision. Now, Latter-day Saints will often say something like this to you, I think. These are like the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. They tell the story of the same Jesus and the same life, but there's a different emphasis and a different audience. And at one level, it's not a crazy comparison, and it can feel compelling. It is normal for people to retell things that have happened to them and things that are formative experiences differently over time. And it's normal for later retellings to become more polished. And it's normal when you retell stories, depending on who you're telling it to put in the foreground different details. But here's one of the little pushbacks on that. The Gospels are 4 separate authors presenting Jesus. The first vision accounts are not 4 independent witnesses. They are one man over time retelling his own story, sometimes in his own hand and sometimes with scribes, sometimes for publication, and actually sometimes for private record. But we're not comparing 4 observers, we're comparing one observer's evolving narration, which means the question has to become slightly different, because we have to ask, why does the emphasis shift? Why does the cast of characters shift? And why does the purpose of the first vision shift? And in the case of the actual first vision, the differences are not only in framing, because sometimes they appear to touch on the core claims. The claims like who appeared, or what was asked, or what was the answer. And again, this does not automatically mean it is fabricated, but it does mean that people who are interested in truth have to treat it as a developing tradition, not as a frozen snapshot. This is not like a photograph. And the church's own narrative history project in Saints basically gives you permission to think in those terms. it does that because it spends time explaining sources, and it says how memory works, and it explicitly distinguishes between the contemporary sources and then reminiscent sources, and notes that the sources that come from, the reminiscent sources, they rely on memory and can include, they don't have to, but they can include inaccuracies and can be influenced by later understandings and beliefs. And I think that's the church saying, in its own voice, we know that memory is complicated, and we know that later retellings of this story are shaped by later meanings. So we're not being rude when we want to question these things. What we're doing is what the text itself, I think, tells us to do. One of the biggest questions, I think, is related to this 12-year gap. And that's the question that really needs addressing. Why did it take 12 years for the first surviving written account to be, the oldest that we've got is 12 years after this? It's true, it could have been written down earlier. So we do need to be precise. The earliest surviving written account is 1832. This doesn't prove that Joseph Smith never spoke of it earlier, and it doesn't prove that he never wrote anything earlier that then got subsequently lost. But it does mean that if you are a historian, then your evidence begins in 1832, not in 1820, and that changes things. I think the church has become more honest at times and at least trying to address these things, even if it doesn't address them in ways that I or others might find convincing. So let's ask, what does the Saints book do with that gap? What it actually does is it gives a narrative explanation. It says that once Joseph Smith realized that sharing his vision turned neighbors against him, he basically kept it mostly to himself. And then it says later that after he moved away from New York, he tried to record his sacred experience. And I think this has interest to me because it describes him writing in what's called halting language, where he's trying to earnestly capture the moment. And then it says, even after that in later years, he recounted the vision more publicly, drawing on scribes who could help him better express what he felt defied description. And it even comments on what changed across retellings. I mean, it's where it becomes less about his own search for forgiveness and more about finding the true church and the need for a restoration. That is a striking admission. Think about that. The church in an official book is admitting that there were changes over the retellings. It becomes less about forgiveness and more about the restoration of the church. And I think if that's written in 1830s, the church gets restored in 1830 around the publication of the Book of Mormon. And that, again, asks questions, I think. Why do we only find out about the need and the comments and the statements of restoration after the restoration? Again, this doesn't prove or disprove anything. It just raises questions. So that striking admission is basically saying, yes, the focus shifted over time. Early on, forgiveness, later on, restoration. So the church provides a fairly faithful possible explanation for why the gap exists and why the emphasis shifts. But again, the historian has to ask, is that explanation sufficient? Or does it leave some problems unresolved? And I think the honest answer is this: it explains some of it, but it doesn't remove the tension. And I say that because if a 14-year-old boy had seen God the Father and Jesus Christ and been told all existing churches are wrong, that it's not the kind of thing you usually keep to yourself for a decade. And Saints itself shows that in the narrative, because Joseph does tell a preacher, and the preacher rejects it and calls it the devil. And then Joseph finds no one will believe him. So there's an early spoken tradition, at least in the telling or the retelling of saints, and the gap is about writing, and it's not necessarily about speaking, but still writing things down matters. And the importance of that is that it shows you something very simple. It shows you how fast this story becomes print and how fast it becomes portable. The book is called The Mormons, or Latter-day Saints, A Contemporary History, and it's published in London in 1851. It comes out of that Henry Mayhew world, the Morning Chronicle investigations of labour and the poor. And then suddenly the author runs into this stream of human movement. It's Mormon emigration through Liverpool. And he says it plainly. He's looking at emigration from Liverpool, and he learns there's this distinct pipeline, an LDS agency with branches across England, Wales, and Scotland, and moving thousands out across the Atlantic. So he decides to write what he thinks is essentially the first proper history of Mormonism available to British readers. And here's why it's included in this work in the first vision. Because he claims he wants to avoid looking unfair. It doesn't tell you who the author is. It's most likely one of the researchers called Charles Mackay, who did quite a lot of the work up in Liverpool. If the book would perhaps be more valuable if it was written by Henry Mayhew himself, but it was not. It would perhaps have been more popular if it was. But I think my guess is that it's probably written by Charles Mackay. So I'm going to assume that. So Charles Mackay says, whenever possible, he will present the story in the words of Mormon writers themselves. And then he tells you exactly what he's doing. He says the early narrative, including what he calls Joseph's first appearance, is as a divinely inspired figure, and he extracts it from Orson Pratt's remarkable visions. So what you're reading in that section isn't even neutral reporting, it's the story as it is already being exported and standardized in Mormon print culture and then reprinted into English public discourse. And look at what version of the first vision comes through in that printed retelling. It's not the earliest inward 1832 feel, it's the more developed public story. You get the persecution reflection, you get the this is like Paul before Agrippa comparison, and you get Joseph insisting basically, I saw what I saw, and the world can't bully me out of it. And crucially, the scene is framed in the two personages' direction. But with this weird bit, it says, I have actually seen a light, and in the midst of that light, I saw two personages, or one of them did. That little wobble there is interesting. Even in the printed narrative, the emphasis is on two personages, but the line itself still contains the oddness. They did, or one of them did. So you can feel in that sentence the story being carried forward but not always with this perfect smoothness. And here's why I'm bringing this in, because it shows you that by the time Mormonism is really hitting Britain, the first vision story is already being moved around as a missionary ready text, and Orson Pratt publishes it in a form designed to persuade. Then a British writer, Charles Mackay, tries to explain Mormonism to the public, lifts it, and republishes it. And now the story is not just a memory, it's now an artifact, a printed object, and something that can be folded and put in your pocket and shipped across an ocean and then reread by the next audience. So when we ask our questions about development, the gap, and emphasis, we're not doing it in the abstract. We're watching the story become the story. Private experience, then public history, then missionary literature, then British reprint culture, then an emigration machine. And that is a different kind of evidence than four independent witnesses, because what you're seeing is a tradition being transmitted and shaped and stabilized as it spreads. And it's also a reminder of something else. The question is, why does the story land in writing when it does? We're not talking about a world that can't write. The Mormon movement is writing and printing constantly. And by the 1840s, it's pushing that print across the Atlantic. So our questions are not hostile. It's just what happens to a founding story when a movement starts needing it to function as public proof and not only as a private memory. And with that British printed version in mind, let's head back to Joseph Smith's own account and ask what changes, what stays, and what kind of differences these really are. The easy move as an outsider is to only talk about differences. But we should always ask both questions: what stays the same and what changes? So let's ask, what stays the same? Across the accounts and later retelling, you do have several recurring elements. You have a young Joseph Smith in spiritual distress, prayer in a wooded place. You have a dark opposing power, or a sense of darkness, and you have a light or pillar of light. There's also divine communication and the idea that something is wrong with the religious landscape. And to be fair, the apostasy theme isn't only a late institutional add-on. It's already there in the earliest surviving account of 1832, where Joseph says in plain terms that mankind had turned aside and that there wasn't a true denomination built on the gospel as it's recorded in the New Testament. So the idea that something is wrong with the religious landscape is present right at the start. It doesn't just arrive later when the story becomes more public and more official. However, we must accept that this is still 12 years after the event and is 2 years after the founding of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Another thing that arrives early is forgiveness. Thy sins are forgiven is right there in the 1832 edition, and it explicitly is used in Preach My Gospel as a supporting quote from another account. And Saints, the most modern retelling, that keeps it too, putting these words into the mouth of Jesus in the narrative. So forgiveness is not a weird outlier. That is consistent. But the question is not, is there overlap? Because of course there is. The question is, where does the overlap stop being reassuring and start feeling strained? And that is where we go next. Before we begin on what changes and why it matters, I just want to remind you that I am outside of the Mormon camp, but I hope that you can see, if you're inside the camp, that I'm not ungenerous and I'm not unfair in my interpretations, that I use your own documents to look at your own history. I'd also say I've had a couple of messages from people on these videos where they have suggested I have a Mormon on the channel, an ex-Mormon missionary, to talk about being on the mission and what it was like. And I would consider that, I think, but we need to get to the end, at least, of this series. If you're inside or outside of Mormonism and you want to have an opinion on whether that's a good idea, then do leave a comment, because I am interested. I can see I'm interested in what you think, and I'm not massively keen on bringing a Mormon missionary on who's just going to, maybe they might just want to try and convert us, because I want to have a real dialogue with people. I think that's what I'm trying to encourage. And also for this series, there's a few things that often come up that have come up. One is that only a Mormon can understand what it's like to be a Mormon. And whilst that's true, what I hope you're seeing in these episodes is I'm helping prepare you and prepare historic Christians for when they encounter Mormons. And then that's when the dialogue begins. And that's when the things I'm saying to you can be tested and we can see if they work. We don't need we shouldn't let Mormonism be interpreted only by those inside it, because they aren't neutral. And I know nobody is neutral, but they have a horse in the race. And it's a bit like, I would also say we shouldn't be listening to those who have left Mormonism in a bitter way. We shouldn't get all our details from them either. So we listen to Mormons and we listen to ex-Mormons and we listen to those who are bitter and we listen to those that still are culturally in love with the movement but no longer believe the claims. And then we listen to those who just think that Joseph Smith really was a prophet of God. And then we create and we think about what's fair and where do we sit on that. So I would push back against those that would say only Mormons are able to interpret their history. I don't agree with that, because I'm not inside ritualism and yet I interpret their history, and I'm not inside Christian heavy metal and yet I interpret their history, and I'm not inside Victorian and Georgian evangelicalism, but I am interpreting their history as well. So history can be interpreted by those outside. We just need to try and do it fairly. Right, so now let's name the changes clearly, because if we're going to talk about it honestly, we have to stop pretending that the differences are only tiny. There are some that are tiny, but there are some that are not. So, difference number one: who appears and how many? In the earliest surviving written account, Joseph describes seeing the Lord. And at the center of gravity is the tender line, "Thy sins are forgiven." It reads as one divine figure addressing him directly, and that seems to be the shape of what's being said. And then in 1838, the claim becomes more explicit and more structured, because now you have two personages. And you have that famous line where one introduces the other, "This is my beloved son, hear him." So the scene is no longer simply the Lord forgives Joseph, it becomes the Father speaks, the Son speaks, and the whole experience is framed as a revelation about the nature of God as well as a personal encounter. And then we come to the modern narrative retelling in saints, and the separation is crystal clear. God the Father is present above him, Jesus Christ is beside the Father. Joseph looks into the face of Jesus Christ, and it is Jesus who speaks the forgiveness line in that story of thy sins are forgiven. So I think we can see what's happening. The forgiveness theme stays, but the staging becomes more explicit, and that is not a neutral detail. The visible separation of Father and Son becomes one of the doctrinal pillars of LDS teaching about the Godhead, and it functions as an argument. It doesn't tell you that Joseph had an experience. It tells you that Joseph saw the Godhead in a particular way. And that way is routinely contrasted with classical Trinitarian theology. So it does matter, because later LDS teaching leans on that separation in a serious theological way. So the second difference is what the driving question is, because in 1838, the driving question is denominational. It's which church is right, which of these sects is pleasing to God, and the answer is not merely a comforting, comfortable, reassuring answer. The answer is judgment and an instruction. They are join none of them. They have all gone astray. And in the earlier framing, the burden of sin is more central. So the why is not primarily help me choose between churches. It's what do I do with my guilt and my condition and my standing before God? And again, the modern church narrative in saints is unusually candid about this development. It explicitly says that as time went on, Joseph wrote less about his personal search for forgiveness and more about the need for the restoration and the universal LDS message. So the story's why changes shape, not in the sense that it becomes an opposite story, but in the sense that the emphasis shifts from inner redemption to a public authority. And that shift happens at exactly the point you'd expect a growing religious movement to require a firmer origin story for its institutional claims. Difference 3. There is added physical detail and also added what you might call cosmic detail. The physical struggle material becomes more vivid in later retellings, and especially in the latest retelling. The unseen power, the thick darkness, the sensation of being seized, and the tongue swelling so he cannot speak, and footsteps behind him, but nobody is there. And there's a kind of terror that isn't just, I felt bad, but a full-bodied, almost cinematic opposition. And then Saints pushes it even further. It describes the pillar of light with that of noonday brilliance and seems to add a host of angels, and it intensifies the cosmic atmosphere. That it's not just lights and words, but now there's a whole heavenly scene. Now, you can explain that expansion in a couple of ways. You can say this is a more detailed remembering later. Or This is a detail chosen for narrative effect and spiritual impact. And I think either of those explanations could be plausible. But again, the historian's job is to ask questions that don't go away just because we want a tidy story. We have to ask what and where is the evidence trail for those details? Where do they first appear in the record? Why do some tellings include them and others not? And crucially, how do those added details function as part of the story? Do they merely color the story, or do they change what the story is doing? We already know the difference between two kinds of divergence. One is multiple witness testimony diverging because different witnesses notice different things. That can still be the same event, that can still be normal. The other is a single tradition growing over time as it is retold, formalized, and given a stable shape within the community. That growth can be sincere, but it is not the same phenomenon as four independent eyewitnesses or four independent witnesses. These are different categories of evidence. And if we pretend they're identical, then we're not doing history, we're doing public relations. Now, with those changes out in the open, the ones that I think are the biggest changes, we can ask the next question. Not, are there differences? Because there obviously are, but what kind of differences are these? And do they, or what do they suggest about how the first vision becomes the first vision story? I want to go back to missionary practice because this is the lived reality for most people watching. Either you've been a missionary, you are a missionary, or you'll meet a missionaries. Unlike people like me, missionaries don't lead with historiography, okay? They don't read with what we've just done here, looking at the four different visions. They lead with testimony and an invitation. And again, I'm not saying that to be insulting. It's just what Preach My Gospel is designed to do. It's training for conversion-focused teaching. So let's go back to what it instructs. Memorize the central lines from Joseph Smith's history, chapter 1, verses 16 to 17. Always be ready to describe the first vision using Joseph Smith's own words, bear sincere testimony of its truth and importance, and explain that there are four accounts of the first vision, but anchor the conversation in the canonized one. And then it frames Joseph's experience as a pattern. Like many people, it says, Joseph had questions. He wanted forgiveness. He read James 1:5. He prayed, God answers. Therefore, you should pray too. And the Book of Mormon promise is presented in the same logical action of read, ponder, pray, and be willing to act. So when missionaries tell this story, they're not merely giving information, they're building a pathway. They're saying that Joseph prayed and received a witness, and that you can pray and receive a witness. And that witness becomes the foundation for believing that Joseph was a prophet and the gospel was restored. That is the structure of what they're trying to do. And that means if you bring up historical tensions, you're not just debating details, you're touching the very mechanism of conversion. Because the first vision is not a decorative add on story, it's basically the hinge that opens the door into, or not into, depending on what you decide, the Mormon church. So let's think about what some of the questions might be, because here are the ones that I think are really unavoidable. And really, I think I'd probably encourage you to use them in conversations with Mormons, because I think they're fair. They're not gotchas and they're not insults, but the questions arise naturally from the sources. So the first question really is, why does the earliest account look more like personal repentance than institutional restoration? The 1832 account's emotional center is guilt and conviction and then forgiveness, whereas 6 years later, the account is confusion about denominations and the claim that existing churches are all wrong. And Saints itself acknowledges that the emphasis shifts in that direction over time. So we could ask, is this simply a different emphasis for different audiences, or is this a story being repurposed as the movement develops? When I say to ask questions, I mean to actually ask the questions and then listen to the answers. You're trying to make them think, they're allowed to make you think. So, question number 2, what do we do with the one person versus two personages issue? Because if the earliest surviving written account focuses on seeing the Lord, and later accounts stress two separate beings, then we must ask, was the earliest account simply less explicit, or does it reflect a different understanding at that time? And again, that has importance because it ties into developing LDS teaching about the Godhead, which doesn't stay static. And one of the other questions I would ask is, what do we do with the 12-year writing gap? As I've said earlier, Saints frames it as a mixture of persecution and privacy, and later attempts at to write in halting language, which actually means, I realized I said this earlier, I should have told you what that meant. It means sort of stop, start, and a bit clunky, like Joseph was reaching for words but not quite landing on them. And then later with scribes, they sort of helped him tell it more smoothly. So the whole idea of halting language is that he couldn't get the words out. So we can ask, really, is that the best explanation? Has Saints come up with a good explanation? Is it the best one, or could it have been written earlier and lost, perhaps? That is possible, but we can't prove it. So we have to deal with the evidence that we have, and the evidence that we have begins 12 years after the first vision. So the first vision of spring 1820. And our first account of it is in 1832. Another question I would consider is, are the added details evidence of like a fuller memory, or are they evidence of perhaps a narrative growth? The tongue swelling, the footsteps, the host of angels, the dramatic cosmic scene. These details give the story power and authority if you believe them. But when do these details first appear in the record? And why are these details which feel important absent elsewhere? Is it that because with any developing tradition, details tend to accumulate? Again, that doesn't automatically disprove it, but it does tell you the kind of text you're dealing with. And that brings us to the most modern retelling, which we're going to look at because I think it's really instructive. You can pick up this book for not very much money, actually, or you used to be able to. It's called Saints, the Standard of Truth. It's available online as well. It depends if you like real books or not real books. Saints is fascinating because it's a church-produced narrative history and it's explicitly aware of how sources work. I appreciate that a lot. It tells you in its notes on sources that contemporary sources show what people thought in the moment, while reminiscent sources can be influenced by later beliefs and can include inaccuracies. I think that's a careful, almost historian to reader statement. It's basically saying, we know we need to think about memory and we know we need to consider and think about time. And then Saints gives you the most vivid single retelling of the first vision, where it pulls together elements that readers perhaps tend to hear separately. So it's the most detailed account. It includes footsteps behind him, but no one there, an unseen power seizing him, thick darkness closing him, and doubts and awful images flashing across Joseph's mind, a pillar of light descending, seeming to set fire to the woods, and then the Spirit of God filling him with peace and joy, and God the Father above him, then Jesus beside him, then the line, "This is my beloved Son, hear him." Then Jesus says, "Thy sins are forgiven," and Joseph asks, "What church shall I join?" And the answer is, join none of them with the commandment, because they're teaching the commandments of men, they have a form of godliness and deny the power. And then a statement that sacred truths have been lost or even corrupted, and a promise to reveal the fullness of the gospel in the future. And then we have a host of angels. And then afterwards, we have the social consequence that people won't believe him. A preacher dismisses it, then says it's from the devil, and the revelations has ceased. Joseph wonders why he is persecuted for telling what he has seen, and then Saints explicitly narrates the development of the written record. He said he kept it mostly to himself. Later, he tried to record it, and later he recounted it more publicly using scribes with a shifting emphasis. So I think Saints does something very clever. It tells the story in a way that feels continuous and complete. It's like it's the whole arc. And then it tells you in the background that the sources are layered and that memory and later meaning play a role. I think that is, in a way, the church giving you the faithful version of a believing historian's approach. But even then, it still leaves you with a tension because the narrative is smooth and the sources are not smooth. And that's where I want to sort of begin to close, really, with that real question. Because if we're told to treat Joseph Smith's accounts as basically like the Gospels and basically harmonious, then we need to be able to say what kind of harmony we mean. Because harmony can mean two different things. It can mean the same event, different angles, as it were, but with the same core claims, or it can mean later retellings absorb earlier material and shape the story into a form needed by the movement. And those two claims are not identical. The first vision accounts show both continuity and development. They all the different retellings share themes and they share some phrases, but they also shift emphasis in ways that track with the growth of the church's institutional claims. We don't have time to go into that here. I might do that, look at how they viewed the Godhead through time. And even the church's own modern narrative history acknowledges, sort of in its own way, that the story changes shape across time. So if you want to talk to a missionary about this, don't argue, don't just argue, but ask. Be explicit. Ask what they've been trained to emphasize. We know the answer to that because it's in their manual and we've read it, or I've read it, and you can go and read it and preach my gospel. Emphasize the official story and then bear testimony of it and then use it to move people towards conversion, and ask why the canonized account is privileged in their thinking, and ask, importantly, how they understand the differences. It's not new news that there are differences. It's not new news. Go on the church's website. They explain the differences. They explain that there are 4 accounts, and then they try and harmonize them. And you're the people watching that have to decide, are they doing that in a fair or an unfair way? And then, as the church has acknowledged, we should ask whether they think memory can reshape the meaning of things, because their own sources already admit that this is how human remembering works. This video feels quite long. If you've made it to the end, thank you. Like it, subscribe to the channel. It would be of great help. We will continue our walk next time through Mormonism, where we will look at the line from the Book of Mormon musical that said, "Then appeared an angel. His name was Moroni." And so join me next time where we'll talk about the angel Moroni story. God bless.